the end of your life? Are you afraid of it? Are you?
No, I'm not. I don't fear death. I try to avoid it, as I think we all do. But I suspect that in the end I will welcome it.
Tim Curry's final reflections on death now sound haunting in a way few could have expected. Because when he was asked whether he feared the end of his life, the legendary actor gave an answer that has taken on an entirely different meaning following his death in Los Angeles at the age of 80. Curry did not speak as though he was rushing toward death, and he did not claim to know when his life would end. But his calm words about eventually welcoming it have left fans looking back at that conversation with a heavy heart. In the interview, Curry was already living with the lasting effects of a devastating stroke he had suffered in 2012, an event that changed nearly every part of his daily life and forced him to confront limitations he could never have imagined during the height of his extraordinary career. He revealed that the stroke required serious brain surgery and that he spent roughly a month in the hospital before beginning rehabilitation. One of the most difficult parts of that recovery was something that had struck directly at the heart of who Tim Curry was as a performer and communicator. He had to learn how to speak again. For someone who had built a career around his voice, his wit, his theatrical presence, and his ability to command an audience, losing the ability to communicate must have been an especially profound challenge. Curry himself described how strange it was, joking about the fact that he was someone who loved to talk and had always loved words. He admitted that he loved communicating, and that simple statement revealed just how much his voice meant to him. Yet even after everything he had endured, Curry did not present himself as someone consumed by self-pity. His recovery was difficult, and his physical limitations remained serious, but his attitude was remarkably resilient. A strong nurse would wheel his hospital bed outside into a courtyard so he could feel the California sun, something Curry said was deeply important to him. Those small moments became part of a much larger story about survival, adaptation, and finding reasons to keep moving forward even when life had changed dramatically. The people who mattered to him also rallied around him during that period, giving him support as he faced a future that looked very different from the one he had once imagined. Curry continued to live with sensitivity and weakness on his left side. He explained that although he was no longer completely paralyzed, his left arm and hand could be extremely sensitive, sometimes making even touch painful, and he could not always use his left arm or left leg normally. The physical consequences remained with him years after the stroke, but what stood out was not simply what Curry had lost. It was the way he continued to approach life without allowing those limitations to completely define him. During the interview, he was asked whether he thought about the end of his life as he grew older and whether death frightened him. His answer was remarkably direct. Curry said he did not fear death. He acknowledged that, like everyone else, he tried to avoid it, but then came the words that fans would later hear in an entirely different way. He said he suspected that, in the end, he would welcome it. The interviewer naturally wanted to understand what he meant. Curry explained that he thought it might be comforting to simply say goodbye, and he spoke about wanting to earn the privilege of no longer being here. Those words were not presented as a prediction of an imminent death. In fact, when the interviewer questioned whether he was looking forward to it, Curry made clear that he was not. He was not rushing toward death, not galloping toward it, and not suggesting that he expected to die soon. Instead, he seemed to be expressing a philosophical acceptance of something every human being eventually has to face. But after news of his death emerged, those quiet reflections suddenly carried a painful weight. Tim Curry died in Los Angeles, and his longtime manager confirmed that he passed away peacefully at his home in the city. A cause of death was not immediately available in the material surrounding the announcement, although Curry had experienced significant health challenges for years following his 2012 stroke. Reports also indicated that authorities responded to his Los Angeles home after a medical emergency, and there was no indication of foul play. He was pronounced dead at the scene. For fans who knew Curry primarily through his unforgettable performances, the news represented the end of an era. His career had been defined by an extraordinary ability to become almost completely unrecognizable from one role to another, but there was one character that permanently changed his place in popular culture. In the 1970s, Curry became internationally known for his portrayal of Dr. Frankenfurter in the Rocky Horror Show and its legendary film adaptation, the Rocky Horror Picture Show. The performance was flamboyant, fearless, theatrical, and unlike almost anything audiences had seen before. Curry brought a commanding presence to the role, creating a character that became inseparable from the cultural identity of the film. But reducing Tim Curry to one character would never have been enough to describe his career. He was an actor, singer, voice performer, and stage presence whose work stretched far beyond Rocky Horror. His career earned major recognition, including a Daytime Emmy and nominations and honors connected to his work in theater and television. Yet perhaps one of the most remarkable qualities Curry possessed was the ability to hold a room. During his final interview, the discussion turned toward his father, who had served in the Navy and who Curry remembered through family visits to naval bases and Sunday chapel services. Curry recalled that his father could preach and hold people's attention, and when the interviewer suggested that perhaps this was where Curry had inherited his own ability to command an audience, Curry simply acknowledged that he had certainly tried to develop that gift. That detail feels especially meaningful when looking back at his career. Tim Curry could walk onto a stage or appear on screen and immediately change the atmosphere around him. His voice, his expressions, his timing, and his ability to communicate gave him an unusual power over an audience. Even after the stroke affected his speech and mobility, that fundamental ability to connect with people remained part of his identity. His final years were not simply a story of decline. They were also a story of recovery, perseverance, and refusing to surrender completely to the circumstances that had changed his life. The fact that he had to relearn how to speak, yet continued to communicate with humor and honesty, makes his later interviews especially emotional to revisit. There was something deeply human in the contrast between the performer who once commanded enormous stages and the man who later had to fight simply to regain the ability to speak clearly. Yet Curry never seemed interested in turning his suffering into a performance of self-pity. When asked whether there had been self-pity, he admitted that there may have been some, but he did not admire self-pity. He connected that attitude to his mother, suggesting that his refusal to dwell on his circumstances was part of what he had inherited from her. That mindset helps explain why his comments about death sounded so calm. He was not romanticizing death, and he was not pretending that his health struggles were easy. Instead, he seemed to have reached a place where he could acknowledge mortality without allowing fear of it to dominate his remaining life. That is why the phrase about eventually welcoming death has become so haunting after his passing. It can sound like a prediction when heard with hindsight, but the interview itself does not establish that Curry knew when he would die or that he was predicting his own death. What it reveals is something more subtle and perhaps more powerful. He had made peace with the idea that life eventually comes to an end. For someone who had already survived a major medical crisis and fought through an extraordinary rehabilitation, that perspective carries a different kind of emotional force. Curry had experienced what it meant to have his life suddenly altered. He had known what it meant to lose abilities he once took for granted. He had experienced the frustration of being unable to speak, the physical limitations on one side of his body, and the uncertainty that followed a serious stroke. Yet he also remembered the people who stood beside him, the nurse who helped him feel the California sun, and the loved ones who rallied around him. Those details show that his story was never simply about illness or mortality. It was about the people and moments that made life worth continuing. Now, after his peaceful passing at his Los Angeles home, fans are revisiting those words with sadness because they reveal a side of Tim Curry that audiences did not always get to see. The larger-than-life performer was also a man who understood vulnerability, who had endured profound change, and who could speak about the end of life without panic. His final reflections do not prove that he predicted his death, but they do show that he had thought deeply about what death meant and had reached a surprising level of acceptance. And perhaps that is why those words feel so powerful now. Tim Curry spent decades teaching audiences how to hold their attention, how to embrace unforgettable characters, and how to find something extraordinary in performance. In the end, his own words gave fans one final glimpse behind the characters and costumes, revealing a man who had faced enormous challenges and still found a way to communicate, laugh, remember, and keep going. His death leaves behind questions about what his final days were like and a sense of sadness that a performer with such an unmistakable presence is no longer here. But it also leaves something far more lasting. The laughter, the performances, the voice, the characters, and the memories remain. And when fans hear him calmly saying that he did not fear death and might one day welcome it, those words may never sound quite the same again. They were not a prophecy, but after his passing, they feel like a final reflection from a man who had already learned that life can change without warning and that sometimes courage means continuing forward without knowing what comes next. Tim Curry's story ultimately ends not with fear, but with the legacy of a performer who survived extraordinary hardship, continued to connect with people, and left behind a body of work that will continue speaking long after he is gone. His final interview may now feel painfully prophetic, but perhaps its deepest message was never about predicting death at all. It was about accepting life, appreciating the people who stand beside you, and finding the strength to keep communicating even after everything has changed. For generations of fans, Tim Curry will remain more than a legendary actor. He will remain a voice, a presence, and a performer who could hold an entire room in the palm of his hand. And now, as the world says goodbye, those final reflections offer one last reminder of the remarkable man behind the legend.